Hi, everyone. My name is David Conway. I'm a CPA with Conway Tax Certified Public Accountants. We're a full service CPA firm located in Orland Park, Illinois, and we help closely held businesses run and manage all aspects of their business. Most recently, we've been helping our clients deal with the new environment that's been created by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're helping them take advantage of the assistance that's been made available to them, primarily in the form of the PPP loan program. With everything that's been going on and the speed that with which information has been being released and changing, we decided to make a few videos that would help us advise you and help you understand the PPP loan program in general and the forgiveness process and some of the calculations that go into that. It's not exactly the most exciting topic, but I will try to keep it in as plain of English as I can, and make the video as concise as possible while still covering the information that we need to cover. So by now, most of you have probably received your PPP loans and have started spending the money. And so the next step here is to ensure that we spend the money in a manner that maximizes the forgiveness. And while this may sound pretty straightforward, I can tell you it's not as cut and dry as it may seem. And while it's not impossible, there's a good chance that you're not going to have 100% of this loan forgiven. The reason for that is that just the way they structured the loan program, they based the loan amount on 2.5 months worth of payroll. And the time period that you have to spend that money is only 8 weeks. And on top of that, they limit the amount of non-payroll expenses to 25% of what you spend. So those three things combined raise some challenges for some companies in getting this money spent in a way that would have it 100% forgiven. On top of that, the application is actually quite involved and tedious, and it has a number of nuances that even we're still trying to work our way through. We've gotten a lot of good guidance from the SBA in the form of this application for forgiveness and some interim final rules that were released that have done a fairly good job of clearing up the questions that we've had. But there's still some questions that remain unanswered and some new questions that have popped up that we're hoping the SBA is going to issue some guidance on going forward. So just to review how you get your loan forgiven in general, you have to meet several criteria. The first of which is that at least 75% of the money you spend has to be spent on payroll. And payroll expenses include obviously compensation that's paid to employees, but it also includes employer contributions to retirement plans, um, employer contributions to health insurance, and state unemployment insurance. It does not include employee contributions to retirement plans or health insurance, and it does not include employer portion of payroll taxes. It's also limited to $15,385 of compensation for the 8 weeks. And what that is 100,000, 8 weeks worth of pay at $100,000 annually. And so you can pay your employees more than $100,000 a year, but amounts in excess of the 15,385 during that 8 week period are not going to be eligible for forgiveness. And in the event you don't have other expenses that qualify, or you've maxed out your non-payroll expenses, it will result in a reduction in forgiveness. And so, just you should be aware of that. The second criteria is that you have to spend the money within the required time frame. I touched on this earlier, but generally speaking, it's the 8 week period following the date of the loan disbursement. And this is known as the covered period. And you'll hear me reference the covered period a number of times throughout this video and subsequent videos. And so that's what I'm speaking of. The third criteria is that you have to spend the money on eligible expenses, which include payroll expenses, rent, utilities, and certain loan payments. Fourth criteria is that you can't have a reduction in your FTEs, which is your full-time equivalent employees, during the covered period when you compare that to your reference period that you choose. The SBA did come out and confirm that the FTE calculation is going to be based on the average hours worked per employee divided by 40. There was some discussion that maybe that work week would be based on a 30-hour work week, but they decided to go with the 40. The fifth criteria is that you can't have a reduction in pay for any individual employee. Employees making over 100,000 are excluded from this, but employees that are making under 100,000, you cannot reduce the rate of pay. And so numbers 4 and 5 there that I just mentioned are really where you're probably going to spend most of your time calculating what your forgiveness amount is or what your reduction in forgiveness is. And it's also where you're going to probably run into most of the issues and unanswered questions that we have. And so we'll be doing a deep dive into how you calculate all that information in a subsequent video. And so I'm not going to get into that in this video, but we'll let you know when that next video is available for you to watch. So what we're going to do today is go through the PPP loan application for forgiveness. And like I said, I'm going to keep things at a pretty high level on this video just to give you a basic understanding of the process and how it works. And then we'll be doing that deep dive into certain aspects of the forgiveness application and calculations involved in subsequent videos. So I'm going to share my screen here and let you see. This is the Paycheck Protection Program loan forgiveness application. And so this document is 11 pages long, and it's made up of 4 different parts, which you'll see here. First part is the PPP loan forgiveness calculation form. This is basically where all the numbers go and are calculated to result in your loan forgiveness amount. The second part is PPP loan schedule A. This actually feeds the first part and is where a little bit more of the detail is found. The third part is the PPP schedule A worksheet, which feeds part 2 of the PPP schedule A, and is where a majority of the work is going to be done. And then the fourth part is optional, and it's the borrower demographic information. So when you go to apply for your forgiveness, you're going to submit parts 1 and 2 to your lender. Parts 3 you'll keep for your records, and if you decide to do part 4, that would be submitted to your lender as well. And so you'll notice that this first page is mostly definitions, and so I'll let you read through those on your own, but there are a couple I want to cover. And so what you'll notice here is the definition of the covered period that I mentioned earlier, and this is what's actually written into the CARES Act, into the law, and this hasn't changed from what the law was. What is new with this document is this alternative payroll covered period. And what happened was there was a lot of pushback to the SBA and the Treasury that businesses and the AICPA, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, wanted a little bit more flexibility on the time period in which you could spend the money. And so SBA's solution to this was to create this alternative payroll covered period, which allows you to, for payroll purposes only, to make your covered period start on the first pay period, the first day of the first pay period following the loan disbursement date. And this is important because it allows you to line up your covered period with a pay cycle, which makes things a little bit cleaner in the administration of this calculation. Leading up to this, without this alternative payroll covered period, you would have had to split your first and last payroll into things that, work that was done inside the covered period and work that was done outside the covered period. The reason for that is that the law states that expenses have to be incurred and paid within the covered period. So again, this was the SBA's solution to, help administer the forgiveness calculations and make it a little bit more friendly to the end user. Moving on to page 2, this is the line items for the payroll loan forgiveness application, the instructions line by line. So I'm not going to go through each line individually, but I do want to point out that this note here under line 4 that says for lines 2 through 4, you're not required to report payments that you do not want to include in the forgiveness amount. And so lines 2 through 4 are the total of your non-payroll eligible expenses. And the reason that this is important is because 2 reasons really. One is that it indicates to us that the 75% rule is going to be based on the amount you spend, not the amount of the loan. And so leading up to this, there was some question as to whether or not you had to spend 75% of your loan amount on payroll to get any amount forgiven, or if the 75% was going to be based on the amount that you spent. And so you could spend less than 75% of the entire loan and still have amounts forgiven. And so the result is that it is based on the amount you spend, which allows for some additional flexibility and is really borrower friendly, as is most of this document. The second reason that it's important is because it indicates to me that the SBA is not going to do what I call dollar tracing. A lot of banks have required that you open up a separate bank account for your PPP loan funds. And, I think the reason for that was because, well, one of it is because the bank wants your business, but the other was because maybe the SBA was going to look at the specific dollars that were given to the borrower and see where they went. This indicates to me that that's not going to be the case, and it's going, they're going to allow you to spend the money, commingle it with your regular operating funds. You can spend your money on your regular expenses, and then when you go to request forgiveness, you'll just apply for forgiveness for the eligible expenses that you spent the money on. You still have to be careful. You can't just go spending the money on anything, because you could still be charged with fraud if you intentionally misuse PPP loan funds. A little bit further down page 2 here, I want to point out that this item right here, so I mentioned a little bit earlier that the original law states that all expenses have to be incurred and paid within the 8-week period, the covered period. And so this piece of the document changes that a little bit. And it says that payroll costs incurred but not paid during the last period of the covered period are still eligible for forgiveness if they're paid on or before the next payroll date. Again, this just adds a little bit of flexibility where we don't have to do a special payroll at the end of that 8-week period to capture all of the work that was done up through the last day of that period. We can just wait and pay it on our normal schedule and then apply for forgiveness for the amounts that, the amounts that were paid for work done within the covered period. Similarly, down here in the non-payroll costs, this is basically saying the same thing for non-eligible non-payroll costs, that if it was incurred during the covered period but paid after the covered period, it's still eligible for forgiveness. And the interim final rule that came out subsequent to this document went a little bit further and basically said that you could even be eligible for up to 3 months worth of these expenses, subject to that 25% limitation. And so, this may not be as big of a deal as it may seem, but it's still beneficial to the borrowers and allows for maybe some potential additional forgiveness. So moving on to page 3, this is actually the PPP loan forgiveness calculation form, and it's where all of the work that you do on calculating the amounts that are eligible for forgiveness and the reduction of forgiveness will end up on this form. The first half of this form is really just administrative stuff, the business name, business address, EIN, SBA loan application number, loan disbursement dates, stuff like that. There are a few things I want to point out, though, and one of them is this: employees at the time of the loan application and at the time of forgiveness application. The reason I want to point this out is because it really has no bearing whatsoever on the forgiveness calculation. And so that begs the question, why did they ask for this information in the first place? Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you on that, but there's a lot of speculation that what they're doing is trying to figure out what employers are doing with their employees after they've gotten the loan forgiven. What they do with that information is anybody's guess, but again, there's people out there speculating that, and this is kind of a cynical view in my opinion, but speculating that they may try and reduce your forgiveness or do something along those lines. Again, I don't think that's the case, and I think that's a pretty cynical take on it, but you should just be aware of that. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is this line here. And it's a checkbox that says if you received more than $2 million in PPP loan funds, you have to check this box. The reason that is there is because there were several companies out there that received PPP loan funds that maybe shouldn't have, because they have either enough liquidity to survive this pandemic without the PPP loan funds, or they have access to capital markets that small businesses don't. Two big examples were the LA Lakers and Shake Shack. Both are large companies and both have sufficient liquidity to weather the storm. And so the SBA basically said that anybody that received more than $2 million in PPP loan funds is going to get audited at the end of this and make sure that they, number one, needed the loan in the first place, and number two, spent the loan funds in the appropriate manner. That does not mean that people that received less than 2 million are out of the woods. They could still be selected for an audit by the SBA, but anybody that received over 2 million is definitely going to get audited. So down in the second half of this page is, like I said, really where all of the expenses end up. The reduction in forgiveness due to reduction in wages, and the reduction in forgiveness due to FTE reductions. So you come down to line 11, and this is the forgiveness amount that they're saying is calculated. But interestingly, if you have an EIDL loan, the amount that ends up on this line is actually going to be reduced further by the amount of your EIDL advance. And that advance is separate from the EIDL loan, but it is the $1,000 per employee up to $10,000 that many of you received. And as to why they didn't build that into the calculation of the forgiveness amount, I have no idea. But it is definite that they will be reducing the amount here by that EIDL grant. This page 4 is really just the certifications that you're making as a borrower. I'm not going to go through any of this in any level of detail, but you really should read these and make sure you understand what they're asking, and make sure that you can make these certifications in good faith, because it's important. And if you make these certifications not in good faith, you could be charged with fraud or fined. And so just make sure you read through these, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. So page 5, this is the instructions for PPP Schedule A. And again, most of what is on Schedule A actually comes from the Schedule A worksheet. So there's really not much here that we need to go over. We'll cover most of it on the Schedule A worksheet page and in subsequent videos when we do the deep dive. But a few things I do want to point out. And the first here is this line 9, which talks about the owner compensation. And so this is new as of this document. The original law, as I mentioned earlier, limits the amount of eligible compensation to the $15,385. And this document adds to that for owners, business owners, they will also be limited. They'll be limited to the lesser of 2019 compensation, or the 8-week equivalent of the 2019 compensation, or the $15,385. Again, this is not in the law, but it is in this application, and it is how the SBA is going to be administering this, and so we have to treat it as if it was in the law. I know I've talked to many of our clients and told them, yeah, you can increase your pay up to 100,000 and still expect it to be forgiven, but that is no longer true. And so we need to back off on that. Although this is still true, this is only relevant for owners. If you have non-owners, like use regular employees that you wanted to kick a bonus to or something like that, that's still perfectly fine. One of the things that has not been addressed at all, and so it kind of makes me a little wary that they may address it in a negative way going forward, is people related to owners. So spouses or children, are they gonna not allow you to add them to the payroll or increase their pay if they were already on the payroll? As of now, there's no rule against it, and so we're still anticipating that is still allowed. But again, there's nothing stopping the SBA from coming out and saying that that's not allowed. So we'll keep you updated as to the developments on that. The other thing I wanted to bring to your attention here is that, again, in the original law, you have to calculate your FTEs and see if there's a reduction, and they give you 2 reference periods that you could use. Those reference periods are February 15th of 2019 to June 30th of 2019, or January 1st of 2020 to February 29th of 2020. What this document does is adds a 3rd reference period for seasonal employers only, and it is any consecutive 12-week period between May 1st, 2019 and September 15th, 2019. So I just want you to be aware of that. If you're a seasonal employer, you may be able to benefit from using one of those 3rd alternative periods. And the one thing we don't really know is what defines a seasonal employer. And so we're hoping for some additional guidance, guidance on that. Moving along, page 6 is the PPP Schedule A. And as I mentioned earlier, most of what you see here is going to come from the Schedule A worksheet. And so I'm not really going to get into this. We'll cover it in the worksheet section or in the subsequent videos. And so moving on, pages 7 through 9 are really the Schedule A worksheet instructions and the Schedule A worksheet itself. And again, I really don't want to get into too much detail here because it gets so excruciatingly into the weeds that it's not really conducive to this video. But the gist of the Schedule A is that you will need to list out every employee, the amount that they were paid for the covered period, their average FTE for the covered period, and any amount of wage reduction or reduction due to FTE reduction. There's also this safe harbor for the FTE reduction that I'll mention that, at the risk of oversimplifying, if you had a reduction in FTEs, but you replace those FTEs by June 30th of 2020, then you can avoid that reduction. And so you should be aware of that. Again, we'll go into the detail in a later video. Page 10 is the documentation that you have to maintain for all of this loan forgiveness. And it's really split into 2 sections. First is the documents that each borrower must submit with the PPP loan forgiveness application. And the second is documents that you must maintain but are not required to submit. There's a few things I want to point out. First is under the documents that you have to submit, and under the payroll item A, they want bank account statements or third-party payroll service provider reports documenting what was paid to the employees. The reason I want to call this out is because bank statements by themselves will not tell the bank anything about what amount is available or eligible for forgiveness. On a bank statement, you'll see a net check that's paid to employees, but the forgiveness is based on a gross check. You'll also see the amount of taxes that were paid over to the government, but there's no way to discern what amount of that tax was withheld from the employee versus what amount was the employer's responsibility. And so bank statements alone will not allow you to figure out what amount is eligible for forgiveness. And so that leaves us with third-party payroll service provider reports. And so the question becomes, what happens if you do payroll in-house and don't have a third-party payroll provider? And the answer is, well, I don't know what the exact answer is, but our our speculation is that banks are going to not take that third party, quote unquote, too literally. And as long as you provide payroll reports that support the support the expenses that you're requesting forgiveness for, you should be okay. And then you can potentially support that information with bank account statements. The other piece that I want to bring to your attention is this FTE documentation. And the reason I want to bring this to your attention is because while you only have to submit the documentation for the reference period that you choose, we're encouraging all of our clients to calculate it for all of the available reference periods to figure out which one would be the most beneficial to use. And so this becomes a pretty cumbersome process when you're dealing, especially if you have a lot of employees. You're going to be dealing with two, or potentially three different reference periods that you need to calculate the FTEs for. And so it can become cumbersome, and there is a lot of data involved here. And so you should be thinking about, how you get this data and how you're going to be calculating that stuff now, as opposed to, when it comes time to submit this application. Under the documents that each borrower must maintain but are not required to submit, item B here is basically saying that you have to take a look at every paycheck for every employee in 2019, annualize it, and see if it was more than $100,000. And again, I wanted to call this out to your attention because, for the same reason as the FTE, is that this is going to be a very cumbersome process, especially for people that have a lot of employees and or a frequent payroll cycle. If you have a large number of employees and pay them weekly, this is going to be a lot of data. And so you should just be thinking about how you're going to handle this and how you're going to keep this organized in a way that is going to be beneficial for you, calculating out what you need to calculate, and also keeping the documentation in a way that you can eventually, if needed, give it to the SBA or the bank if they request it. And then lastly on this, I wanted to point out that they are saying that you have to keep your documentation for 6 years after the date the loan is forgiven or repaid in full. And so what that means is you could potentially need to keep your documentation for up to 8 years. If you end up with an unforgiven amount that results in a 2-year loan, and you utilize the full 2 years to repay that loan, then you need to keep your documentation for 8 years. That's obviously important because if the SBA comes in and you don't have the documentation, it's very likely that they're going to revoke your forgiveness and you'll have to pay all of that money back. And just generally speaking, when it comes to documentation, I would strongly encourage all of our clients and anybody watching this video to keep very detailed and very organized records around all of these expenses and pieces of information that they need and are requesting. This last page, as I mentioned, is the PPP borrower demographic information form and is optional. They say that it has no bearing on the loan forgiveness decision. We think that the reason they're asking for this is to determine if there was any discrimination in the issuance of the PPP loan or the issuance of forgiveness. And so if you feel compelled to fill this out, feel free and you can submit that to your lender. If not, you are not required to. So that pretty much wraps up our review of the PPP loan forgiveness application. If you think that you're going to tackle this application and all the calculations on your own, then be sure to watch our follow-up videos on doing the deep dive into the Table 1 and Table 2 calculations. I think that'll be really beneficial to you. If you've seen enough here just to know that this is not something you want to tackle, please feel free to give us a call. We'll get you the information that we need to fill this application out on your behalf and get all the documentation in order. You can contact us. Our phone number is 815-463-9150. I am at extension 3, and you can also contact Ray at extension 1. And you can also reach us via email at david@conwaytax.com or at ray@conwaytax.com. I hope this video was helpful, and keep an eye out for future videos. Thank you.